the studios in Brea, California, here is the Doiled In Podcast.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Doiled In Podcast. So excited to have Eric Ulis in the house today. Eric, welcome in.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, Eric, so you're involved in three cases that have blown my mind over the years. But let's tackle the one that, and I talked to some people, they're like, they've never heard of this, so this is going to be great for them. And people who have kind of heard of it and want to hear your take on it after me telling them who you are. So take us back to Thanksgiving Eve. It's November 24th, 1971. And we have this man, potentially his name is Dan Cooper, boards a plane. You want to tell us this whole intriguing scenario here?
Yeah, sure. The guy, again, November 24, 1971, so it's Thanksgiving Eve. And a guy boards, actually steps up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter in Portland, Oregon, and buys a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle, which is typically a 36-minute flight. He pays with a $20 bill because the cost is $20. Within the hour, he boards the jet and hijacks the jet. Ostensibly, he's carrying an attaché case with a bomb. I tend to believe it wasn't a real bomb, but who knows? And that sets in motion a series of things that take place. Simply put, he wanted $200,000 in cash. He wanted 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes, and all of that stuff delivered to the Seattle International Airport, SeaTac, before he would let the jet land in Seattle. So that ended up finally getting all put together within a few hours. The jet lands in Seattle. He gets the money. He lets the 35 passengers go. He lets 2 of the flight attendants go as well. But he does keep the 3 pilots on board the jet, 1 of the flight attendants, and obviously he stays on the jet himself. The jet's refueled. He tells them he wants to fly to Mexico. They say they can't fly to Mexico. It's just simply too far, in part because part of his demands on the trip down to Mexico, he said, I want the jet to travel no higher than 10,000 feet in altitude. I want it to remain unpressurized. I want the flaps to remain down at a 15-degree flap setting, a very specific flap setting. And then you wanted the landing gear to remain down. So it was flying in a very drag, heavy, dirty configuration. So that sets in motion a series of conversations between the flight crew and himself. Ultimately, he decides to let them fly to Reno, Nevada, refuel in Reno to apparently fly to Mexico. One of the other interesting things that he wants is he wants the jet to take off from Seattle with the air stairs down. Now, this was a Boeing 727, which is a very unique airplane in that it has an air stairs apparatus that deploys from the back bottom of the fuselage. And he wanted those stairs down, effectively dragging on the runway while taking off from Seattle. The pilots objected to that. Ultimately, Cooper agreed to let them take off from Seattle to head south again, first stop Reno, with the air stairs up. And he noted that, let's fine, go ahead and take off with the air stairs up, but as soon as we get off the ground, I want to lower those air stairs. So that's what happened. Jet takes off from Seattle. After a couple of minutes, there's 1 flight attendant back with him that he sends to the flight deck and tells her to stay up there with the pilots, which she does. And so he's in the back all by himself. And about 36 minutes after taking off, he jumps out of the back of the jet while the jet's traveling at 10,000 feet at about 200 miles per hour. With the money, with 2 of the parachutes, the briefcase with the bomb in it is no longer there as well, and he's never been seen or heard from again. So that's really, therein lies really sort of the crux of the mystery. So at this point, officially, we don't know who he is, don't know his real name, we don't have a picture of the guy, don't know where he came from, don't know where he went, don't know whether he lived or died.
Incredible.
And I should say, To add to that, about 8 years after the skyjacking, a portion of DB Cooper's ransom, $6,000 of it, was found buried along the Columbia River at a place in Vancouver, Washington called Tena Bar, T-E-N-A, Tena Bar. And it was 3 packets of rotted $20 bills stacked upon each other just below the surface of the sand that a little boy found when he was out one afternoon with his family. And that's also somewhat of a mystery, because where these 3 packets of ransom were found was nowhere near where they believe DB Cooper actually jumped from the plane. So that's sort of a mystery in and of itself. But outside of that 3 packets of 20s that was found, that's the only certifiable piece of evidence that's been found outside of the jet, and that was found after he actually jumped from the jet. Everything else related to this in terms of evidence and so forth was collected in Reno, Nevada, after the plane landed in Reno to refuel. And I should mention that where he jumped at 36 minutes after takeoff was very near Vancouver, Washington. So that's it. It's been almost 52 years now. It's the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history, and there it is. There's the real life challenge of trying to figure out who this guy was and what happened to him and what happened to the $194,000 that's unaccounted for and everything else for that matter.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the composites here that they did from witnesses. These are from flight attendants and people on the airplane, I think, is what they got these from, correct? So he's not a big guy. He's not like intimidating. So did he just hand a letter off to the flight attendants and didn't have any other weapons, no guns, no knives, just saying he had a bomb on him, which again, he may or may not have. And that was just as easy as it was back in 71, right? I mean, it was no air marshals or anything.
Well, there were actually air marshals, and DB Cooper actually was concerned about it, because on a couple of occasions he did mention something to the flight attendants about, I hope there's no air marshals on this flight, or that there aren't any problems as far as that goes.
Oh, wow.
But is well taken. 1971, you could just walk on the plane. There was no metal detectors or anything of this nature. You could carry anything you wanted onto the jet. Additionally, when you showed up at the ticket counter, in this case Portland, when he showed up and bought the ticket, he didn't have to provide identification. So he gave the name Dan Cooper, but there was no driver's license or anything he showed to verify that name. And presumably Dan Cooper is not an accurate name. Now, right. I should mention media reports discussing the skyjacking within several hours of it taking place misnamed him DB Cooper. He didn't give the name DB Cooper, he gave the name Dan Cooper, but somebody made a mistake and the name DB Cooper kind of worked its way into the news, and it just stuck. Because it's just a last name. So
Right. And you think that kind of messed with the whole investigation, where people are now looking for DB Cooper instead of Dan Cooper, and it kind of throws things off a little bit?
Well, the FBI did actually take the time to explore Dan Coopers and DB Coopers and all kinds of things, and never came away with any, just in the off chance that he happened to give a real name. But
sure. It
seems quite apparent that the name that he gave was not real. So
I know there's, after all, that they put out these composites, and there's hundreds and hundreds of leads, and they had 800 suspects at one point from what I read. But the main suspect, which I put up there prematurely there, Richard McCoy. What's your take on McCoy? You think he's the guy? You think that they're close, or you think no?
Here's the thing about McCoy. McCoy actually pulled a similar skyjacking about 6 months later. He actually asked for $500,000, so he went all out on that and got away. He actually jumped and got away with the $500,000. However, a few days later, he was caught. Apparently, he had kind of run his mouth a little bit too much and kind of bragged about how he could do the same thing DB Cooper did, but would ask for more money, that type of thing. That managed to work its way to law enforcement, and they knocked on his door one day in Provo, Utah, and found the $500,000, I think minus $30, if I'm not mistaken, stashed in his closet. So he got caught. Now, looking at Richard Floyd McCoy, he does have a striking resemblance to at least one of the D.B. Cooper sketches. There's a few D.B. Cooper sketches which are all very different, so I don't know really how to account for that.
Right.
But so there's that part of it. But there are a couple of things working against him that indicate that he wasn't D.B. Cooper, and I think the biggest thing is that this occurred only 6 months after the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, and every one of the witnesses from the D.B. Cooper flight got a chance to see McCoy's picture and presumably
Still
hear
fresh.
him. And every single one of them said that he was definitely not, that's their words, definitely not D.B. Cooper. So when you've got all of the witnesses saying he's not the guy, well, he's just not the guy. So
right, some kind of copycat.
Yeah, he's a copycat, and like I said, he bore a striking resemblance to at least one of the sketches for D.B. Cooper.
Yeah, and you would have to think that Cooper probably had some kind of air flight background or knowledge. If he picked out the exact plane that could have that stairway lowered down, knew how it was going to be, knew which flight path it was. It's not like today where you can go on Google and see which plane is flying, from Seattle to Oregon. There was no internet or anything back then, that they would just put flights out. So he kind of had some knowledge of which plane was the correct plane to hit.
Yeah, there were really only two planes that would have worked as a practical matter. There's a 727, and then there was also the DC-9. Both of those have that back air stairs apparatus. So he did his homework, a little bit, as far as determining that, if I'm going to jump from an airliner, let's start with one that has these, air stairs. So that made a lot of sense. Beyond that, he did exhibit knowledge related to the 727 specifically, not only that 15-degree flap setting that I mentioned up front, but he also knew the flight of jet unpressurized. There was some reference to where the oxygen bottles are located on the plane. He seemed to know where that was. So he did seem to have some familiarity with that Boeing 727. And I also think it's noteworthy that the crime itself took place on an airline or on an airplane. So presumably he was kind of operating his wheelhouse. He felt somewhat comfortable in this realm, meaning the aerospace realm, the aircraft realm. I suppose it's possible the guy had never flown on a jet before, but that does seem unlikely given, demonstrated.
Yeah, I would imagine he's either, has some pilot experience or some military experience, knowing those planes and the pressurization, knowing how to operate a parachute and survive. Do you think there was anybody else involved, or why he may have asked for 4 parachutes as opposed to just the 2, one for the money, one for himself?
Well, he did ask for 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes. So that's so basically 2 sets of parachutes, because normally you jump with the main parachute on the back and you have a reserve attached to the front, which works obviously if the back one fails. I'll just say that the authorities speculated that perhaps he was going to have one of the flight crew jump with him. Obviously, if the authorities are thinking perhaps he's going to force somebody to jump with him as well, they're less inclined to mess with the rigs, make them not operational or something like that.
Good point.
So perhaps that was sort of part of what he was thinking. I tend to think it probably had less to do with that and more to do with the fact that he wanted the shroud line from at least one of the parachutes, because he did use the shroud line to attach the money to his person. I think he probably used it to attach the briefcase to his person. So it just seems to me that he probably had in mind that he was going to be using some of the shroud line from one of the parachutes. So if you're going to be cutting up one of the parachutes and using shroud line from it, and in this case he used about 100 feet from one of them, cannibalized one of them and took out about 100 feet of shroud line, you want to make sure you've got extra parachutes there. So I suspected that was probably part of his thinking to begin with, and it really had nothing to do with forcing one of the flight crew to jump with him or any
Right.
such thing. I think he probably deduced accurately that they're not in a business of on purpose delivering him parachutes that are not going to function and therefore kill him.
Right.
That seems a little bit extreme. There's no reason to think in the minds of the authorities. I'm sure there's no reason to think that let's let the dude do what he wants to do. Let's make sure the passengers are safe. Let's make sure the crew is safe. Let's get the aircraft itself back in good working condition, which is obviously a very valuable piece of equipment. And then we'll eventually catch this guy. We'll catch up with him. He may be on the run for a few days, but we'll get him eventually. But as it worked out,
No, 52
he's the
years
one that
later.
got away.
But so the flight path, do you think there's any significance to where he was flying from? And two, do you think he's from that area, or do you think maybe he's from a different part of the country and he's trying to, throw, authorities off on this whole thing?
I think it's important to note that he did not give a flight path to the authorities. He simply said, when all was said and done, make a first stop in Reno to refuel. And there were a few different ways the jet could have departed Seattle and flown to Reno. He did not provide any type of flight path. In fact, the flight crew itself had seriously considered the whole notion of taking off from Seattle and heading out to the West Coast and basically flying off the coast south to presumably somewhere around San Francisco, the Bay Area, and then flying, due east over to Reno. Ultimately, he was cleared on a different, or rather, they were cleared on a different path, which basically took the jet due south out of Seattle, right back over Portland, where the whole thing started, continued south to Eugene, Oregon, south into the Northern California, and then the jet kind of headed off in a southeasterly direction at that point and flew over the Sierra into Reno. But I tend to think, for a number of different reasons, I tend to think that D.B. Cooper was familiar with Seattle, familiar with the Pacific Northwest, but he didn't live there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's been a lot of newer information, scientific information that's developed recently that I think pretty strongly indicates that he probably came from the East Coast, specifically the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. Primarily because there is a major Boeing subcontractor called Rem Crew Titanium, which later was renamed Crucible Steel. They were a supplier of specialty metals to Boeing and other aerospace companies, not only for commercial purposes, but also for military purposes. And there were particles, there were very unique particles found on D.B. Cooper's clip-on tie, which he happened to leave behind on the jet, I think by accident. That were discovered in later years, and I think those very unique particles, metal particles that were found on the tie, indicate that he came from that sort of specialty metals environment, working in the aerospace sector, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Sure.
There are three very specific particles that I actually discovered a little over a year ago: the titanium and antimony alloy that seemed to tie in specifically to this Rem Crew Titanium company, again, based in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. So I tend to believe that's where he came from, was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, traveled to Seattle on business with Boeing. So he was familiar with Boeing, familiar with the 727, familiar with the Seattle region.
Right.
And there you go.
Very interesting. Have you heard Chael Sonnen's, former UFC fighter, his take on all this?
I've heard of several different takes on a variety of things, and a lot of it is just pure bullshit. To be honest with you, my opinion, I'm not prone to conspiracy theories or anything else. I like to follow the science, follow the math, follow the evidence as we know it. Yeah. But I think it's pretty clear to me that some of the stuff that I've heard about people that were D.B. Cooper that died and confessed and all these other kind of things are just there's just absolutely nothing to back that up. There's no evidence. There's no tie-in. It's very
Right.
easy to say after the fact, yeah, Grandpa so-and-so is DB Cooper, but have absolutely nothing to back it up with. Not even a good story, to be perfectly
But he
honest
told
with
me.
you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But this the kind of thing is that we've got to have any kind of viable or credible DB Cooper suspect is going to have to answer some very basic questions like how do you account for the particles on the tie, what happened, where'd the money go, all these other kind of things. And thus far, I just haven't heard anything from any of these stories that can
Right.
really sort of check off the boxes or explain. And one other thing I should mention about DB Cooper is that according to the witnesses and the primary witnesses, what I'm talking about here, meaning the flight attendants and the gate agent and so forth, DB Cooper was described as a guy basically close to 50 years old. So he's probably about 50 years old. And also he was a guy that was described as between 6 foot and 6'1". And their recollections were remarkably consistent. So I actually believe that DB Cooper was a guy who was about 50 years old and probably about 6'1".
Okay.
Which is a little bit, that's actually a pretty tall individual. That's a pretty tall man for,
Sure.
1971, because if he was, let's say, 50 years old in 1971, that means he was born in 1921. And only 10% of American men that were born in the 20s were either 6 foot or 6'1". Nowadays we got a lot of guys that are 6'1" and taller. But
Right.
back then, so much. So that's a pretty important piece of it right there. So there are a lot of suspects that tend to work their way into the story that are 5'9" or even shorter. And I hear stories like that, and I'm like,
Yeah. Forget about it.
the problem is he's just simply too short,
Right.
and there's no reason to think that, what the witnesses described in terms of DB Cooper's age and height isn't pretty accurate. So you got to kind of work with the evidence as we know it.
Yeah. And you mentioned a tie, which is a big part of the evidence. And I just recently saw your interview on CNN, where you're suing the FBI to release
Yeah.
that piece of evidence to yourself or just to the public to possibly retrieve some DNA evidence.
Well, the FBI, the tie is in FBI custody at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. I am probably the last person to have seen it, the last person in the DB Cooper world. Those of us who are investigating the case or familiar with the case. I saw it in October of 2021, so almost exactly 2 years ago now, if not exactly 2 years ago. So I know where the tie is. What I requested from the FBI was to get access to the tie for myself and a DNA retrieval specialist, not to actually go and have them send me the tie or take the
Sure.
tie home or anything else, but literally a DNA specialist on and me, we would show up at FBI headquarters. We would have access to the tie on their property, and they can certainly have an agent in the room providing oversight, have access for 30 minutes to 60 minutes so that the DNA retrieval specialist could try to retrieve some DNA from a very specific part of the tie. It's a clip-on tie, and there's this clip-on apparatus that has a little metal spindle. And it's a little metal spindle that I believe actually would likely contain some of DB Cooper's DNA, and actually may well be uncontaminated just because the spindle is currently in the closed position. All the pictures I've ever seen of that tie in FBI custody shows the spindle as being in the closed position. So I tried to work with the FBI to see about getting access for the purposes of doing that, and then we'll expend private resources to analyze it and see if we come up with a DNA profile, but they rejected that. So ultimately, I ended up filing suit in federal court in March, trying to force access to the tie for myself and a DNA specialist. So as it stands right now, we're just waiting to hear from the judge.
Any
We've
time frame on that? Are they battling
no,
hard against you on it, or is it just in limbo?
it's right now we're just waiting for the judge. The last briefs were filed with the court about 4 months ago. So we're just waiting for the judge to rule on a particular motion, and we'll just see where that goes. The judge obviously is the boss, so she
Yeah.
can do whatever she wants as far as you know, deciding when she's going to issue a ruling with respect to that. This is at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. So they've got a lot of stuff going on there
Yeah.
right now for those who are kind of aware. But so that may have something to do with it, to be perfectly honest with you.
Okay.
But having said that, the government's waiting and I'm waiting, and we'll just see what the judge orders as far as this is concerned. I hope that one of two things happens. I hope either the judge gives me access to the tie for that 30 to 60 minutes as requested, or perhaps, better yet, the FBI just decides they're willing to play ball. At the end of the day, this case has been closed since 2016. It's been closed for 7 years. The case, is unsolved, the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history. We're not using public resources. We're using private resources to do this. We're not asking to take the tie, out of the, off of the FBI property or anything of that nature. So it just it begs the question, why not? I mean, why not just give us access for 30 minutes to see what we find? And it is important to note that they actually did grant access 2 times before to a gentleman named Tom Kay and a small group of scientists. This was back in 09 and in 11, 2009 and 2011. And the case was actually opened at that point. It was still open at that point. But there was a lot. They learned a lot from examining the tie, using state-of-the-art technology versus, what the FBI had in 1971 and 1972. So,
but they didn't grab DNA from it.
What's that?
They didn't grab the DNA from it. They didn't try and do a DNA test. Everything but that.
No, they didn't. I should say that they did, vacuum part of the tie and use sticky stubs on part of the tie. And I did speak with Tom Kay. I know Tom Kay well a couple of years ago because I had a History Channel show that I headlined called The Final Hunt for D.B. Cooper, part of the History's Greatest Mysteries strand. And this one came out in 2020. And we examined some DNA because, and where we got that from was, as the sticky stubs were applied to the tie by Tom Kay and his group, I reasoned that they probably pulled off some DNA at the same time, not just, metal particles and things of that nature. There's probably DNA in there. And so he did give me some of that material to look at. And we had it analyzed by a company in Florida, and they did come up with a DNA profile, but unfortunately, the profile they came up with, I think, is a contaminated profile, was one of us basically.
Gotcha.
So so that didn't do us any good. So I think that looking at this spindle and opening the spindle up, having it swabbed, and seeing if there's any DNA there to be found provides our best opportunity to come up with a complete or close to complete and a clean DNA profile for D.B. Cooper and D.B. Cooper alone. So that's why this is so critically important, because this actually has the potential to solve the case. And obviously on some level, it's very frustrating to me because in my mind, there's really no good reason for the FBI not to play ball and say, sure, come on over and see what you can come up with. To just simply categorically say, go F yourself. I don't know. I'm not really down with that. So, so that's why we're in court with it. We'll see what happens.
Well, hopefully the FBI, wakes up, because I know you've been on CNN and a couple of podcasts, and maybe we can get the word out, and maybe it'll put pressure on them to wake up and realize, that this is something that the public wants to see.
Yeah.
And you're involved with the Netflix series DB Cooper, Where Are You? That's still streaming on Netflix. Great little series. I think if you really want to dive deeper into your knowledge of this, that's definitely a place to go. Great series, man.
Yeah, it was a was a 4-part series.
Yeah.
I was just one of the people that was interviewed, throughout the series about the case. The Netflix series tend to focus on a guy named Robert Rackstraw as possibly being Cooper. I do not believe Rackstraw was Cooper, and I discuss that on the
Yep.
series along with several other people. But no, it was things like that are actually, I think, very good, very helpful, because I'm a big advocate of getting the word out publicly. Whether it's through Netflix series or History Channel. I was on Josh Gates's Expedition Unknown in 2021 talking about the case, and I've done, a lot of media stories and reports and things on the case, and that's really critically important, I think, because we're at a time 52 years out where it is possible that there are still some people with firsthand information with respect to the true identity of D.B. Cooper. I mean, the man had to have some kind of family. I mean, he came from somewhere,
Right.
and there may be somebody who knows something but just doesn't realize they know something. So by keeping it alive in the public's mind and getting the word out, my thought or my hope is that perhaps somebody at some point sees something and something is sparked in their mind, and they're like, maybe that was, Grandpa Fred, it sounds kind of like him,
Right. Right.
that kind of thing. So it's possible. We'll see what happens with that.
And yeah, if you get somebody coming forward like that who's really adamant that they know who it is and they're willing to provide DNA evidence, maybe that then will help the FBI go, okay, well, let's see if it matches and go from there. But you have a great event that's coming up here next month, and it's actually Boston in 2024, Seattle in 2024, and Dallas in 2024. Before we go on to the Gardner Museum heist, give us a little rundown of the CooperCon events, the one coming up next month in Seattle, November 17th through 19th.
Yeah, CooperCon is an annual event. This is the 5th year of it. It started in 2018. So we did it in 2018, 2019. We missed 2020 because of the pandemic, of course. Then we were back on track in 2021 and 22. So this is the 5th year of it. And it's a 3-day event that takes place in Seattle. And it's great. It's actually a lot of fun. Friday, November 17th through Sunday, November 19th. And there's a number of panel discussions, presentations, things of that nature, first-hand witnesses. I mean, for example, I'm going to be on stage with Bill Mitchell, who was the passenger who sat right next to D.B. Cooper just across the aisle. So he remembers D.B. Cooper, well. So he's going to be interviewed on stage. Larry Carr, who was the former FBI special agent in charge of the investigation, what's called the Norjack investigation in the Seattle office. We're even going to have a copycat there, a guy named Martin McNally, who several months after the skyjacking was a D.B. Cooper copycat, managed to survive, jumped with the money, got out, had never jumped before, by the way. But same thing, he talked too much and got caught and ended up spending a lot of time in prison. So he's going to be interviewed on stage. There's also going to be some presentations from people like Tom Kay, the scientist that I mentioned, digging into some of the scientific evidence and so forth. And a lot of other people like myself will be there talking about the case and various things. So it's a great 3-day event. It's an awful lot of fun. And one of the things that I've strived to do with CooperCon is to make it viewer friendly, I guess is probably the way, audience friendly. And what I mean by that is I encourage audience engagement, audience conversation. So at the end of each panel, we take questions directly from the audience and so forth. So it's more than just sitting there listening to experts and others talk about the case. You can actually discuss your thoughts, ideas, theories, things of that nature, and get to hear in real time what people like me and others think of it. So that's a 3-day event. And every evening we get together and have, drinks and hamburgers, that kind of thing at a local brew pub. But anybody who's interested in checking that out, if you just Google CooperCon or CooperCon 2023, you'll pull it up. The web address is cooperconevents.com.
Yep.
Yeah, cooperconevents.com.
Very
yeah,
interesting.
it's a lot of fun, and like I said, it's getting bigger, better, and badder every year. So yeah, this is the 5th year of it, and it's really exciting. And the cool thing about it is, speaking of the Netflix show actually was filmed. A portion of it was filmed at CooperCon in 2019. I think it was 2019. So the 4th episode of that Netflix special, DB Cooper, Where Are You? It actually starts out at CooperCon, and it kind of gives you an idea of kind of what takes place there. I was interviewed obviously on that as well at CooperCon and everything else, but you never know who's going to show up because
Yeah,
there's actually a lot of interest in on the part of Hollywood and others.
absolutely.
CooperCon and just the CooperCon story. So you never know. You may find yourself being part of a Netflix show or something else. You happen to show up at CooperCon this year.
Yeah, and I'll share more of that here in moments. But if we can shift gears real quick,
Yeah.
you're not just involved in this case. You've got a high interest in the Garden Museum heist, and for those who don't know, that was a huge heist, 1990.
Yeah.
And you give us a rundown of that. I mean, this sounds like an inside job to me.
I think, well, yeah, I mean, it took place March 18, 1990, right after St. Patrick's Day in Boston, middle of the night, 2 guys dressed as Boston police officers managed to talk their way into the museum by way of the security cards there. And over the course of 81 minutes, rip off 13 pieces of art. The collective value of that art nowadays is pegged at between 500 million and $1 billion. Some spectacular masterpieces, Rembrandt and Vermeer and pieces like that. And none of it's ever been recovered. And there is a $10 million reward for the recovery of the art, or a portion thereof. So maybe if you find a portion of it, you won't get the full 10 million. You may end up
Sure.
with a
Get
cool
something.
million, that kind of thing. But they've never been able to find anything related to this. It's been approaching 34 years now. So that's a case that I've had a lot of interest in as well. I believe I know who did it. I believe I know what happened to the artwork. I discuss some of that on my website. I have a personal website, ericulis.com, that reviews some of my investigations and research and so forth. But that's a case that I'm also interested in as well. And
So since you have an idea of who this might have been or what happened to the art, are you working with authorities on that? Is that something that you're...
I've communicated with the museum director of security there at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, and have managed to really get nowhere. I will say that the authorities believe that organized crime was involved with this thing. I couldn't disagree more. I think they're absolutely wrong about this. I don't think it was organized crime. I think it was 2 basically random thief guys. I believe the leader of the group, if you will, is a guy named Brian McDevitt. He's no longer alive. He had a friend of his named Steve Donahue, who is also no longer alive. So I think Brian McDevitt and Steve Donahue were the culprits. And there's a lot to the story. Brian had a girlfriend named Stephanie Rabinowitz at that time, who knew nothing of this, but by the grace of God, she actually kept a daily diary, a daily journal. So, she's recording daily events in her life with Brian and everything during that entire time, not knowing anything of this. Reading back in her diaries now, which total about 800 pages during this period of time, a lot of details and things are really remarkable and interesting. So I think that goes a long ways towards actually making pretty clear what happened to not only who did it, but what actually ended up happening to the art.
So you got the timelines from her diary that match when she's not with him and these crimes are happening and everything else.
Exactly.
So yeah, it all matches up. That's incredible.
It's a fascinating case. And I know Stephanie very well, and I've talked with her at length about this. She gave me full unfettered access to her diaries. I'm the only person who has ever had that. I'm the only person who's read the diaries.
Wow.
She was interviewed by the FBI 2 separate times, once in '92, once in 2004. They received some transcripts from her diaries that they requested, but they never took the time to read the full text of the diaries. Yeah, so having said that, that's an interesting case. I've got a spin-off of Cooper Con that is called Cooper Con Crime, and the Cooper Con Crime events, which you alluded to. That's brand new, starting in 2024. The first one is taking place in March of 2024 in Boston,
Right.
and that's a 2-day event. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is the Isabel Stewart Garden Museum heist at that Cooper Con Crime Boston event. So. But that's a fascinating case, and I believe there's an opportunity to get some resolution there as well. But you know, the thing is that I've noticed is that there does appear to be reluctance on the part of law enforcement, whether we're talking an active case like the Garden Museum heist or something that's even closed like DB Cooper. There does seem to be some sort of institutional resistance, which I understand at some level. Because let's face it, there's a lot of crackpot ideas and theories and people out there, but it's a little bit disheartening in some ways as well, because you have serious investigators like myself, I think, bring a lot to the table. And, you know, we end up getting kind of thrown in the trash bin along with the other crackpots as
Right.
well. And I think that's a grave disservice, quite frankly, to law enforcement. So hopefully that changes at some point, but, you know, I do understand at a certain level why it is that law enforcement has sort of resisted, you know, working with people like me.
Anybody in particular, yeah.
Yeah.
Understandable. And then, of course, you know, you have a take on the whole JFK assassination. Anyone who knows me knows that's something I've been intrigued with since I was a little kid. Um, what's your take on this? Because I think you believe that Oswald fired a shot. Do you believe that, or?
Yeah, I believe, and I'm a big JFK fan as well. In fact, I was just at Arlington Cemetery, went to visit his grave a week and a half ago.
Nice.
So I've covered JFK's life at length. I've been pretty much everywhere that mattered, including Dealey Plaza. Yes, I believe that the Warren Commission report was essentially correct. I don't believe there was a conspiracy. I believe Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone shooter. I believe the guy was just a nut. And he took 3 shots at the president that day, 2 of which hit, 1 of which missed, and the rest is history. The one part of the case that I've been particularly interested in was trying to ascertain which of the 3 shots that Oswald took that day missed, because we know 1 of them missed, 2 of them hit. And the Warren Commission kind of left it alone. They didn't answer that question. There was a House Select Committee who actually looked into the JFK assassination in the 70s, the late 70s, and they issued a report in 79. And they determined that was the first shot that Oswald took that missed. Again, I think they're absolutely wrong. And I did a pretty lengthy video. It's a little dry, but it's a lengthy video that I put on my YouTube channel talking about this with photographic evidence. I walk through the Zapruder film and show exactly what happened. But I firmly believe it was the 3rd shot that Oswald took that missed that day. Now, people may be saying, well, who gives a shit? What does it matter? This is why it matters, because it appears to me that Oswald taking a 3rd shot after the president has already been killed, after Governor Connally has already been shot and is laying down, I think that 3rd shot was intended for Jackie Kennedy, who at that moment actually happened to be kind of climbing on the back trunk of the car and was in a very high profile position. So that's
Interesting.
That's a big new historical revelation if we could prove that she was also a target. And I think that would also speak to the depraved nature of Lee Harvey Oswald in his mind. As bad as November 22nd, 1963 was with the assassination of the president, I actually believe it could have been much worse. We could have lost the First Lady as well that day, but we didn't. So that's why I've had a particular interest in JFK, among other reasons. I prefer to focus on JFK and his life and just who he was and the
Sure.
family. I find that much more interesting than dealing with the assassination. But obviously, you can't be a student of JFK and not spend some time on the assassination.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's fascinating. I've never heard that take before. So that's really interesting. I'll have to take a look at the YouTube video on that, and I'll post, YouTube links and all that as well with this. Um, but Eric, are you guys going to go look for the parachute, the site here pretty soon?
Yes, actually, in 3 days. Yeah,
Oh,
three
okay.
days. Be up there in near where a portion of DB Cooper's ransom was found, looking at a very specific area, kind of a wooded trench area that I think may well hold DB Cooper's parachute. I tend to believe, and I'm one of the few people that believes this, but I tend to believe that DB Cooper actually landed pretty near where a portion of the ransom was found. Now, the official version has DB Cooper landing about 15 or 20 miles away, which kind of doesn't make any sense, and nothing's ever been found there to validate that belief.
Right.
So I believe he landed much closer to where the money was found. I've identified a specific area that I'm going to be searching again here in a few days with some volunteers. So I'm very excited about that to see what we find, because at the end of the day, that parachute was pretty heavy, and I don't see the guy lugging it out from the
Right.
woods or wherever it happened
Dump
to
it,
land.
leave it.
Yeah, I actually did a reenactment of his walking out about 2 months ago with a money bag and parachute and everything else. I had about 60 pounds of gear and stuff strapped to me. And I walked about a mile or so with that stuff, replicated dumping it off and burying the money, and then walking another 10 miles into Vancouver, Washington, to what used to be the Greyhound bus station. And it took several hours to do that. But the one thing that I learned is that, it's physically demanding. It's not an easy thing to do. So my point is that in terms of that, the heavy parachute that he jumped with, I'm absolutely convinced that as soon as he landed, let's say he landed in a field somewhere, which I think is likely, he probably immediately scurried to the edge of the woods and then took it off and just stashed it under some blackberry bushes or something of that nature and just got the hell out of Dodge. And it's still there today. The parachute, which has a lot of stainless steel components and things, would still be there today. And perhaps there's something else there as well. The reason it would not have been found at this point is because those blackberry bushes are killer, and it's pretty rural. This area, it's never been searched. It's private property, so it's very easy for me to see how somebody could throw this thing in an area of sticker bushes and just have it never be discovered. And that's what the fact is. The parachute is very near there, and if it's there, and I'm convinced it is, I'm eventually going to find it.
Wow. And when will we see or know the results of this search? Are you going to post that?
I'm going to be speaking about that at CooperCon. So we'll be taking time at CooperCon, which again at this point we're 3.5 weeks out from CooperCon. So I'm going to go through the search. If we find anything, anything we happen to find will be analyzed and all that good stuff, and then there'll be a full report, full presentation at CooperCon, and that may work its way on to my YouTube channel or something like that as well. I'm going to have media there. There's going to be media there. There's always media attention around this kind of stuff. So I think word would probably get out if we found something really big or something really compelling. That'd probably get out pretty quickly. But that said, anything we happen to find is, it's going to take a little bit of time to analyze and so forth. And my goal is to have a full report. And any kind of artifacts themselves that I may happen to find. I'll have all that at CooperCon in Seattle in a few weeks.
That's incredible. Well, I'm excited to see what you find. This is intriguing to me, especially the last piece you told me there, where the parachute could still be there intact somewhere under a bush, and that's just incredible. 52 years later, I mean, to find evidence of a crime 52 years later would just be outstanding and would be, I think, groundbreaking for this whole case. Um, Eric, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time, man. So insightful. Don't forget Seattle, November 17th through the 19th is the CooperCon event. And go to cooperconevents.com for more dates coming for next year for Dallas, which should be very interesting. I might be in the area for my son's football camps then, so I might have to check that out. Boston, obviously, you got the Gardner Heist there, so that'll be a focus of that one. And then Seattle again next year, August 17th through 18th. So all that information is on cooperconevents.com. EricUlis.com as well is another one for more information on what you're up to currently. And follow you on X at Eric Ulis. I've been keeping up with what you're doing here this coming week and excited to see the findings out there in the fields. Eric, again, thank you so much, my man. Really appreciate your time coming on, and let's keep in touch and keep this going.
Sounds good, brother. I appreciate it.